Welcome to Lesson 7, talking about future active indicative verbs, future middle indicative verbs, and deponent and compound verbs. So take your handbook, please, and turn to page 28 as we look at this chapter. The future indicative is the first section. The future tense ordinarily expresses simple action. It portrays the action as a whole. Okay, so what that means is that there's no indication of ongoing action in the future with the future indicative. It just says the action will happen, which is why a simple translation of the future is the best. As for the forms of the future active indicative, the future tense uses the same stem as the present tense. And I've got a balloon here that tells you what a stem is. The stem of a Greek verb is what is left when you take the omega off of the vocabulary form. Here are some examples. The stem of luo is lu. The stem of balo is ball. The stem of lego is leg. As the textbook notes, the future passive uses a different stem and will be discussed in a different lesson. The distinguishing characteristic of the future tense is that it adds a sigma after the stem of the verb and before the ending. Okay, so that means that a sigma is what I call the sign of the future. You see a verb form with a sigma in it and primary active endings, you know you have a future tense verb. Because it's a primary tense, the future takes the same primary endings as the present tense. So with the chart at the bottom of the screen, you see the forms luso, lucis, luci, lusomen, lucete, lususi. I will lose, you will lose, he will lose, we will lose, you will lose, they will lose. Now, just to remind you what we're talking about when we talk about primary tenses. Primary tenses are the present, the future, and the perfect. And primary tenses use primary verb endings. And the active verb endings are o, is, e, omen, ete, usi. And the middle passive endings are me, se, which normally collapses into a, te, metha, estha, nta. Okay, so these endings are used in the primary tenses, and right now we're looking right here at the future active and the middle. The formula for the future active, I've found this helpful to think of how do I make a future active, or if I wanted to say something in the future, how would I do it? I would take the present stem, I would add a sigma, and add the primary endings. So with the verb luo, the stem is lu. I add the sigma, the sign of the future, and then add the primary active endings. Luso, I will lose. So luo, I am losing. Luso, I will lose. Luis, you are losing. Lucis, you will lose. Louis, he is losing. Lucy, he will lose. All right, so that's it for the future active indicative. The future middle indicative is formed basically by the same principles. You take the stem of the present tense stem, you add a sigma, a connecting vowel, and the primary middle passive endings. And you get lusoma, luse, lusete, lusomatha, lusesta, lusonde. And notice here that future middle translation has for myself, for himself, ourselves, yourselves, themselves, all the way through, because the future middle always has a middle significance. The subject is acting for its own benefit. The formula for the future middle, I already said it, but here it is if it's helpful to see it And text, present stem plus sign of the future plus a connecting vowel plus your primary middle passive endings. So that would be lu, sigma, omicron is the connecting vowel when the ending begins with a mu or a nu. So we get lusome. One more time, just reminding you that second person singular here is luce. It's not lucesse, it's luce. You will loose for yourself. So the endings again, or the forms of the future middle, lusome, luce, luceta, lusometha, lucesta, lusomda. On page 29, three key ideas are introduced. Amalgamation is a combination of consonants. Right here in this chart, it's a combination of consonants. You don't have to hang on to the name amalgamation. That's not really crucial that you add that to your vocabulary. What is crucial is that you understand how this chart works. There are three kinds of letters that when they have a sigma added to them, change. Labials, which are letters pronounced with the lips, P, beta, and phi, when you add a sigma to them, become psi. So, P, beta, phi plus sigma equals psi. So, for example, on the right-hand side, you see grapho, I am writing. And you want to make that future, you take the stem graph, add a sigma to it, but phi plus sigma becomes psi, and so we get grapso, not grafso, but grapso. The letters kappa, gamma, and chi are pronounced by sending air over the velar palate at the top of your mouth, so they're called velars. Kappa, gamma, chi. When you add a sigma to those letters, you get xi. So ago, I am leading, becomes oxo, I will lead. And then finally there's the dentals, letters that are pronounced using the teeth. Tav, delta, theta, zeta. And these letters, plus sigma, drop. That is, the dental drops and all that's left is the sigma. So pitho, which means I am persuading, when you want to make it future, you add a sigma and the theta of the stem drops, leaving piso. Pitho, I am persuading. Piso, I will persuade. As the textbook notes under the chart, some words don't follow the rules. That's to be expected. We're dealing with language. And they note specifically that verbs whose stems end in a double sigma amalgamate with the sigma sign of the future to form xi. And one other irregularity is pointed out because this shows up in the New Testament, that the future form of didasco is didaxo. The stem of didasco is didac. So you wouldn't know that by looking at the present tense form. Key thing I want you to know here is this chart. If you're able to hang on to the information about stems that end in a double sigma and didasco, that's great, but make sure you know the chart. The next section talks about deponent verbs. You need to know what a deponent verb is. Deponent verbs are verbs that have the form of middle passive verbs, but the meaning of active verbs. Another way to say that is they're middle passive in form, but active in meaning. You parse them as middle passive. You translate them as active. We always parse the form. If the form's middle passive, we parse it middle passive, but we translate the meaning. And the key thing that you need to see here is that the way you can know a verb is a deponent is if its lexical form, that is the form that shows up in the vocabulary, ends with a middle or passive ending. For example, apokrinome means I answer, not I answer for myself or I am being answered. It's middle passive in form, but it's active in meaning. We've already learned one of these when we were doing our, our startup total physical response. Last semester I had you jumping and alate, and when I asked you when we would say what I am doing, you would say alome, I am jumping, or alumatha, we are jumping. Well, the form is middle passive, alome or alumatha, but the meaning is active, jumping. In fact, William Mounce says that 70% of the verb forms in the New Testament that are middle passive are actually deponent verb forms, which means they're active in meaning. So, with a statistic like 70%, you ought to assume that if you see a middle passive form, it's likely to be deponent, and you have to figure out what its lexical form is to know whether it is or not. Compound verbs. Compound verbs are verbs that have a preposition prefixed to their stem. So ekbalo is a compound verb. Ekbalo, I cast out. We call that a transparent compound because you can tell the meaning from the parts. Ek, out, balo, I throw. But there are opaque compounds, like in English, pineapple. You'd never figure out what a pineapple was by thinking about what a pine and an apple is. Apokrinome is an opaque compound, which means to I answer. Doesn't mean to judge or distinguish from. Frequently, the preposition that's prefixed to a compound verb also follows the verb in a sentence. So if I say I am coming out, ex erkome, I can say ex erkome ek to yuku. I am coming out of the house. Ex erkome ek. It's very common for the prefixed preposition to follow the verb so that there's kind of a double use of the preposition. In English, we would only translate it once. I am coming out of the house. We don't say I am out coming out of the house. And that's it for lesson 7. The vocabulary here: aperchome, apokrinome, vaptizo, rinome, dikeos, is erchome, ekvalo, exerchome, erchome, lamvano, nomos, uk or uch, porevome, prosevchome, and Christos.